By the time the Nepo-Baby director called me obsolete, I'd already spent 23 years keeping that company's heart beating and its blood warm enough to move. 23 years in the same beige building, under the same flickering ballast lights, listening to the same HVAC rattle through ductwork like an old man wheezing in his sleep. Horizon Freight Systems liked to tell investors it was a logistics technology leader. Inside, it was rusted shelving, half-documented cron jobs, and a network architecture held together with patch cables, chewing gum, and my increasingly questionable loyalty. They moved freight across the continent, trucks, containers, cross-docks, the whole ballet, but all of it, every pound they billed, ran through systems I'd inherited when I still had cartilage in both knees. I knew where every buried cable was, which blades ran hot, what would happen if a certain rack lost power for more than 11 seconds. It smelled like ozone, warm plastic, and dust baked into metal, a smell I could recognize blind, like some people recognize perfume. That was my domain, the server room humming like a confession booth for bad decisions. The new director arrived in late spring with a watch that cost more than my first car and loafers with no socks because apparently ankles had become a symbol of leadership. His name was Cole, but his badge said C. Hargrove III because his father, the second of that line, was the chairman of the board and liked symmetry. Cole was 32 with a resume that was mostly business school and a 2-year tour at a consulting firm where you learn to say synergy without moving your jaw. He came in as Director of Digital Acceleration, a title invented to justify his salary. First day open plan floor, he stood in front of a slide deck with gradient blues and told us we were going to pivot from legacy thinking to a velocity-first mindset. I sat at the back with the other technical fossils, fingers stained with thermal paste and bad coffee, and watched him name every buzzword like he was casting a spell. Cloud first, microservices, data lake, optics. The VP of operations nodded like a dashboard bobblehead. Nobody asked who was going to make any of it real. My job title was Systems Reliability Architect, but everyone knew me as Marion in IT, or the one with the keys. The keys weren't metaphorical. I wore them on a carabiner clipped to my belt, keys to the main electrical panel, to the server cage, to the legacy tape vault they forgot to mention in audit reports. I also had the kind of keys you don't put on metal rings. Passphrases for the root vault, the only safe token that would unlock a handful of ancient, mission-critical systems, and most important, sole ownership of an encryption key shard that completed the company's hardware security module quorum. That last one was the result of a compliance project years back. To decrypt and sign certain high-value transactions, EDI manifests for our top 20 accounts, treasury transfers, tax filings, the system required 3 of 4 key shards. One sat with the CFO, sealed in a fireproof envelope. One was with legal, in a safe. One lived in the HSM itself. The fourth, and the one the auditors loved because it forced IT involvement, was bound to my biometric profile on a UBI-key-like token I carried on a lanyard under my shirt. No shard, no quorum, no signed files. No signed files, no freight tendered, no money moved, no tax filings sent. The company didn't want a single point of failure. In their paranoia, they made one anyway and called it resilience. Then they forgot about it because I never let it be a problem. Cole wasn't interested in keys. He was interested in optics. The minute he arrived, he started scheduling listening tour. He'd swing by the server room in slim-fit trousers, wrinkling his nose at the smell, the mix of cold air, hot plastic, a hint of burnt dust, and on bad days the sour tang of my coworkers' microwaved leftovers drifting in from the break room. The air in there had an edge like licking a 9-volt battery, a faint metallic taste that lingered at the back of your throat. He'd stand just inside the door, careful not to touch anything, and say how he'd heard great things but needed to understand our velocity constraints. I'd try to explain thermal envelopes, the aging UPS that had a known bad capacitor bank, the SaaS vendor lock-in contracts that made lift and shift a fantasy unless he wanted to eat 8 figures in penalties. He'd blink, nod, and then ask if we could just containerize it. It produced a liquid the color of used motor oil and the consistency of thin mud. First sip every morning, it hit the tongue like battery acid, bitter and metallic, coating your teeth in a film that no amount of creamer could disguise. People drank it anyway. I kept a mug on my desk that said this might be whiskey. It was always coffee, always awful, but the joke kept people from asking if I slept. I didn't, not much, not when you're on call for a machine that never closes its eyes. The first time Cole and I truly collided was over maintenance windows. Our flagship system, Orion, ran freight optimization for the entire network, scheduling trucks, assigning loads, optimizing routes based on cost, time, and capacity. Orion had been built 2 decades ago by a contractor who now raised goats in Oregon. It ran on a pair of ancient Solaris boxes we kept alive with parts from eBay. We wrapped APIs around it, disguised it behind sleek dashboards, but the core was fragile and it needed care. Twice a month, we took a 4-hour window in the middle of the night to patch, re-index, and back up everything with a real chance of working. Cole decided those windows were killing velocity and insisted we move to zero downtime rolling updates. He said the phrase like he'd read it in a slide deck about Netflix and assumed a freight company in Ohio could play at that level. I showed him incident reports. The time a skipped index rebuild cascaded into a day-long slowdown that cost us $1.2 million in SLA penalties. The time a vulnerability left unpatched for just one more quarter turned into a security incident we'd had to bury under maintenance anomaly in a 10Q footnote. I walked him through the dependency tree, legacy batch jobs, time zone quirks that meant middle of the night wasn't the same everywhere, downstream reporting engines that choked on schema changes. He listened for about 5 minutes, then cut me off, smiling that practiced, placating smile. He said we needed to reframe our risk appetite and that downtime, even planned, sends the wrong signal to the street. He started showing up to those with phrases like, "We're sunsetting legacy," "We're moving to a cloud-native architecture," and my personal favorite, "We're decoupling our core from brittle back-end dependencies." If he'd decoupled anything, I would have known. The wiring diagram in my head would have tingled. Instead, we were still nursing Orion, still babying the mainframe that handled old EDI flows, still feeding the same backups into the same tape library we pretended was just an off-site cloud tier. The only thing that changed was the number of people willing to question the narrative. That number went down fast. It's a strange thing watching a company gaslight itself with its own investor relations material. Inside, you see the same outages, the same missed patches, the same half-tested integrations shoved into production because a sales guy promised a feature to a customer. Outside, you watch your CEO and a nepotism hire talk about platformification and unlocking latent capacity. They threw those words around while my team of 6 tried to keep the actual latent capacity, the last inches of UPS headroom, from burning down a rack. Cole's war on maintenance windows escalated. He wanted more features faster. He had a pet project, a flashy new control tower dashboard that would give our top customers end-to-end visibility into their loads, complete with predictive ETAs and interactive maps. Marketing loved it. Sales promised it to everyone with a pulse. The catch was that it required clean, real-time data aggregated from systems that had never been asked to share anything in less than 15-minute chunks. We told him that. We said this needs a new event streaming backbone, proper monitoring, a rewrite of half the ETL jobs that still thought JSON was a fad. He heard one word in that sentence, backbone, and decided it sounded too slow. He greenlit the front end anyway and told us to stub the back end for now. On bad days, the whole thing wheezed, but it existed and investors could see it on a slide. Cole won, for the moment. The moment he decided I was obsolete came after a quarterly business review where I'd been too honest. The CFO had asked about operational risk ahead of a big stock buyback. Share price had been climbing on the back of Cole's slide decks. They wanted to juice it further. I told them in my dry way that we were overdue for a catastrophic failure, not if, but when. The UPS manufacturer had sent 2 end-of-life notices we'd never acted on. The generators had skipped a load test for 6 months because facilities didn't want to pay overtime. We had one primary SRE for Orion scheduled to go on maternity leave. The control tower data path had no real fallback. If anything, I said, we're over-leveraged on hope. Cole smiled that tight smile again. He thanked me for my candor and then did what he did best, reframed. He told the room that my team's caution was exactly why we're investing in fresh thinking, and that we can't let legacy mindsets hold back our transformation. He threw in a joke about how I knew the system better than anyone, but that we needed to scale beyond heroes. People laugh the way you laugh when you know you're supposed to. I took a sip of coffee that tasted like burnt tires and swallowed my reply. 2 weeks later, HR pinged me for a quick chat. I knew before I walked in. The HR director had that tight look around the eyes you get when you've been crying in the bathroom between meetings. Cole was there too, of course, in a vest so sharply cut it probably came with its own security detail. He didn't sit. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watch catching the fluorescent light. HR read from a script about organizational realignment and no reflection on your years of service. Cole added his personal touch, telling me the industry had moved on from monolithic thinking and that my skill set was less aligned with where we need to go. He used the word obsolete, like he was talking about a printer, not a person. They slid a manila envelope across the table with numbers inside that would barely cover a year's mortgage. I looked at the envelope, then at Cole. I thought about keys. I thought about covenants, vaults, and the HSM that needed my shard every 6 hours to sign high-value EDI batches and end-of-day cash sweeps. That was the fun part. To prevent long-lived tokens from being abused, we'd set the system so that the full quorum had to be refreshed twice a day, with my biometric touch reauthorizing a time-limited key. The auditors had loved the control. Fantastic separation of duties, they'd said. No single person can misuse the system. They hadn't considered what happened if the person with the shard left the building with her lanyard and no plan to replace her before the next cycle. I asked one question in that room because I like to document my own demise properly. I asked when my last day was and whether they expected me to transition access. HR said the standard, "Today will be your last day on site, but you'll be paid through the end of the month." Cole said they'd have the team handle credentials and that the new guard would take it from here. I nodded. I signed their papers. I did not mention the HSM, the physical keys, the obscure scripts in cron that only I had touched in 5 years. I didn't have to. They had made themselves very clear I was obsolete. Obsolete things get thrown out, not carefully disassembled. They walked me to the elevator like a suspect. Security badge turned in, laptop surrendered. The badge was tied to my domain account, my VPN access, my password manager. None of that mattered to the keys that mattered. The Ubi-style token with my biometric lived on my lanyard under my shirt and no one asked for it. The physical keys on my belt were institutional, generic. They'd just recore the locks if they thought about it. But the encryption shard, the HSM quorum, those were invisible until they were. The next morning, for the first time in 2 decades, I slept through the 4 a.m. maintenance window. No pager, no Slack pings, just silence and the faint taste of real coffee in my mouth, single-origin beans in my tiny kitchen, not office sludge. I sat at my table and watched the sun hit the cheap blinds and thought about what was happening downtown. At 5:12 a.m., the first HSM refresh job would fire per design. The system would look for 3 valid shards. It would find the one in the CFO's safe called by a service account. It would find the one bound to legal certificate. It would see the internal one. Then it would ping the token assigned to user ID MDAWSON. The token would not answer. The job would retry. It would fail. The system, by policy, would lock high-value signing until the next quorum window. If the second window missed too, the system, by policy we'd all applauded in audit meetings, would go into protective lockdown and refuse to sign anything. At 8:03 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an old colleague still inside who hadn't yet learned the art of not using personal devices for corporate gossip. "Is your token still with you?" the text read. "Everything is red." I didn't answer. I took another sip of proper coffee, smooth with notes of chocolate, nothing like the burnt mud at Horizon, and opened my laptop. Not the company's, mine. I didn't need access to know. The signs appeared in public soon enough. First, a ripple on social media, truckers complaining that their loads were stuck in the yard because dispatch systems were down. Then, a few hours later, a terse banner on Horizon's customer portal. We are experiencing technical issues impacting some services. I checked the status page out of morbid curiosity. 3 of 6 product lines were flagged yellow or red. Delayed processing of EDI manifests, latency in control tower updates, temporary suspension of self-service tendering. Control tower dashboards stuck on last night's data. Treasury frantic because the end-of-day cash sweeps to their banks hadn't been signed, leaving hundreds of millions sitting in internal accounts out of compliance with covenants. Tax waiting for sales reports that wouldn't reconcile. Executives shouting into headsets demanding ETAs on something you cannot rush, key quorum. They could have fixed it theoretically without me. They could have reissued the shards, re-enrolled a new biometric, changed policies. But those changes required the existing quorum to sign new certificates. The system, designed to prevent exactly that kind of on-the-fly tampering, had one backdoor: a hardware reset that required physical access, a manufacturer's engineer, and a 48-hour lead time under dual control. We'd never used it. We joked darkly that if we ever did, it would mean either somebody was stealing or somebody was screaming. Now, it meant both. By noon, someone from Horizon finally remembered my personal number. It wasn't Cole. It was the CFO's assistant, her voice sanded down to corporate monotone. She said there'd been a little issue with a security module and could I hop on a call to provide context? I checked the clock. HSM had been half-bricked for 7 hours. Loads were backing up. SLAs were ticking towards breach. I told her politely that I was no longer an employee and that my severance paperwork instructed me not to access Horizon systems. She inhaled sharply at that. I could hear the panic whistle at the back of her throat. She asked more carefully whether I'd be open to consulting support. I said I might, depending on terms. The terms came fast. By 1:30 p.m. I had an email from an outside counsel I knew by reputation, a white shoe firm they brought in when suing or being sued was on the table. The message was crisp, full of disclaimers, but the content was simple. Horizon needed urgent assistance restoring HSM functionality and related systems. Would I be willing to enter into a short-term consulting engagement? They suggested a rate that might have impressed me 10 years ago. I replied with my own number, $10,000 an hour with a $200,000 non-refundable retainer, wired before I touched anything. Also, full indemnity and a written acknowledgement that I'd warned the company about the fragility of the system in prior risk reports. I expected pushback. I got a DocuSign within 20 minutes. The retainer hit my account before my coffee cooled. Consultant, funny word, it tastes better than obsolete on the tongue. They set me up on a video call with the crisis parade. CFO, General Counsel, Cole looking rumpled for the first time since he arrived, tie loosened, hair not quite in place. His loafers were still sockless. At least tragedy hadn't touched his ankles. They briefed me in a rush, leaving out things I already knew. Systems down, HSM not responding, key refresh failed, manufacturer engaged but slow, customers angry, treasury furious, banks asking questions. I let them finish, then asked, in that flat tone I reserve for production incidents and funerals, whether they still had my token. Silence. Then HR, on the call for reasons known only to HR, said she thought I'd turned in all company property. I lifted my lanyard into frame, the black fob catching the light. Not quite, I said. Cole flinched like I'd pulled a gun. I didn't gloat. There's no time for that when a system is bleeding out. I laid out what needed to happen. First, a secure courier to my apartment with a laptop pre-configured for remote access under their lawyer's supervision. Second, someone from Treasury and someone from Operations with actual decision-making authority on the line. Third, an email from legal explicitly authorizing me as an external consultant to interact with production. In regulated industries, paper trails are power. I made sure mine was ironclad. When the gear arrived, I plugged in, authenticated, and slid back into the machine like I'd never left. The smell was different here. My apartment carried hints of old books and the citrus cleaner I used on weekends, but as soon as I opened the terminal and saw Orion's uptime counter, I could practically taste the server room. Cold air, hot plastic, the ghost of my ruined sinuses. My fingers moved on muscle memory. I coaxed the HSM into a safe mode, initiated the out-of-band manufacturer procedure, walked the on-site tech through the arcane dance of jumper settings and key ceremonies. Every step I'd documented for years, but no one had ever read. I used my shard to reconstitute the quorum, this time binding a backup token with a clear, documented process for adding authorized users, one that didn't rely on a woman everyone assumed would die at her desk. 3 hours later, the first batch of unsigned EDI files started to move. Trucks rolled. Control tower dashboards flickered back to life. Treasury sent a cascade of cash sweeps, their wires once again blessed by digital signatures the banks recognized. The crisis calls shifted from panic to exhausted gratitude. Cole tried to say something about how this showed the importance of partnership with our legacy experts. I muted him on my end. The legal clock was still running, 10,000 an hour in 6-minute increments. They wanted my expertise. They could pay for the privilege of my silence too. The stock slide started the next morning. Horizon had to file an 8K disclosing a significant systems outage impacting operations and certain financial processes. The language was a master class in understatement, but the street smelled blood. Analysts who'd been drunk on Cole's digital acceleration pitch took a second look at the risk factors. The stock dropped 12% on the first day, then another 18% as customers whispered about missed deliveries and competitors circled. By the end of the week, Horizon was down 40% from its high. Cole's beloved optics had become a bonfire. They tried to keep him for a while. Blamed the incident on process gaps, spun my re-engagement as bringing in specialized expertise. But markets and boards have long memories when it comes to faces in front of microphones. The chairman, Cole's father, was conspicuously absent from the emergency investor call. The CEO did most of the talking. Cole sat stiffly to one side, eyes hollow, as analysts asked pointed questions about legacy risks and overstated digital progress. A month later, a press release announced that Horizon and C. Hargrove III had mutually decided to part ways so he could pursue new opportunities. His severance, I'm sure, was generous. Golden vests for a man whose real talent was wearing them. My contract, on the other hand, expanded. Crisis turned into stabilization, and stabilization turned into strategic review. The board's audit and risk committee liked having someone who could talk about failure modes without flinching. They also liked that I didn't dress it up. Systems are just bones and nerves. You strengthen them or they snap. I kept the consultant rate $10,000 an hour when they were on fire, a $200,000 retainer for being on call. I started picking my hours, more sleep, better coffee, less fluorescent hum in my ears. Sometimes, when outside counsel looped me into yet another transformation roadmap meeting, I'd see newer faces on the Horizon side, junior engineers, a cautious new VP of operations, a wary interim CTO. They treated me with a respect that bordered on superstition. Like if they didn't, the servers would revolt. I disabused them of that. Machines don't care, they just hum until they don't. It's people who decide whether to listen when someone like me says this will fail. The server room smelled the same: ozone, hot plastic, a faint undertone of dust and despair that no amount of capital expenditure could quite scrub out. The coffee hadn't improved, still tasted like burnt mud, bitter enough to sting the back of your throat. I'd take a sip anyway, out of habit, then go back to the work of making sure the company paid for its second chance. Cole never called me obsolete again. He never called me anything because our paths didn't cross once his badge stopped working. But his words lingered like the aftertaste of bad coffee. Obsolete. Funny, the system he tried to drag into the future had been built on choices people like me made, patch by patch, year by year. The keys I held weren't glamorous. They were heavy. They were also non-negotiable. You cannot pivot around physics. You cannot synergize your way out of quorum rules. You can, however, ignore the person who understands them until the day you can't move freight, can't move cash, can't move your stock price in any direction but down. He called me obsolete. I cashed their retainer from my kitchen with good coffee in my mug and the hum of my own refrigerator as background noise. Somewhere downtown, a red light on an HSM blinked contentedly, key shards in balance, signing away. The company would survive, bruised and chastened, and I would be the line item on their expense report labeled External Consultant Critical Systems Recovery. 10,000 an hour to do what I'd once been underpaid to manage alone at 3 a.m., paid in coffee sludge. The machine gets what it pays for, eventually.